Ethan Williams sat at his desk, the wide glass window framing an endless view of the Napa Valley vineyards bathed in the golden glow of late afternoon. The picturesque beauty of rolling hills was lost on him, his thoughts too dark and stormy to appreciate the scene. His daughter, Grace, had once again crossed a line he couldn't ignore. The private investigator's report lay open on his desk, the details staring back at him like a personal affront. Grace was involved with some no-good troublemaker from Los Angeles, a reckless young man with a reputation for causing chaos. Ethan's jaw tightened as frustration bubbled within. He had given her everything. A life of luxury, the best education, every possible opportunity to flourish, and this was how she chose to repay him? He had tried reasoning with her, but Grace had always been defiant, pushing against his authority at every turn. Ever since her mother's untimely passing, Ethan had taken it upon himself to shield Grace from the harsh realities of life, believing his control was the only way to keep her safe. But now, his grip seemed to be slipping, and he couldn't let that happen. This wasn't just about her choice in men. It was about respect. Ethan refused to sit by and watch Grace throw her future away for some foolish fling. If she wouldn't listen to reason, he would have to find another way to teach her a lesson, one so profound she wouldn't dare defy him again. He stared out at the vineyard, his gaze hardening as an idea began to form. Picking up his phone, he dialed a familiar number. "Mark, I need to speak with you," Ethan said, his tone clipped. The man on the other end, the family's gardener, was as reliable as the sun rising over the hills. Mark had worked on the estate for years, tending to the gardens and vineyards with quiet dedication. He was unambitious, humble, and thoroughly grounded in the simplicity of life, everything Grace had always disdained. That made him the perfect tool for Ethan's plan. Mark arrived at Ethan's office a few minutes later, knocking gently on the doorframe before stepping inside. His weathered cap was clutched in his hands, a small gesture of respect he had always shown. Ethan leaned back in his leather chair, his calculating gaze fixed on the gardener. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Williams?" Mark asked, his voice polite but tinged with uncertainty. Ethan studied him for a moment. Mark was in his early 30s, his rugged appearance bearing the marks of years spent working under the sun. He had a quiet demeanor and an air of calm that seemed unshakable. The very traits that made him ordinary in Grace's eyes now made him extraordinary for Ethan's scheme. "Yes, Mark," Ethan said finally. "I have a proposition for you. It involves my daughter, Grace." Mark's brow furrowed, confusion flashing across his face. "Grace?" Ethan nodded, leaning forward as he explained. "I'm sure you've noticed her behavior lately. Reckless, defiant, irresponsible. She's making choices that could ruin her future, and I can't allow that to happen." Mark hesitated, glancing out the window as if searching for an escape from the conversation. He knew Grace, of course. Everyone on the estate did. She was strikingly beautiful and fiercely intelligent, but she was also known for her headstrong attitude and quick temper. "I want her to learn responsibility," Ethan continued, his voice steady. "To understand that life isn't all indulgence and rebellion. So, I've decided she's going to marry you." For a moment, Mark was sure he had misheard. He blinked at Ethan, his mouth opening slightly before he found his voice. "Marry me?" he repeated, incredulity clear in his tone. "Yes," Ethan said, the word sharp and final. "You're hardworking, dependable, and grounded. You're exactly what Grace needs to understand what real life is like, what life is like for those who don't have everything handed to them." Mark's face was unreadable as he stared at Ethan, processing the bizarre proposal. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Sir, with all due respect, this doesn't seem right. Grace doesn't even like me. And I'm just the gardener." Ethan waved a dismissive hand, brushing aside Mark's objections. "This isn't about whether she likes you, Mark. It's about teaching her a lesson. You'll be doing her a favor in the long run. And, of course, you'll be compensated for your trouble." The room grew heavy with silence, the weight of Ethan's plan pressing down like a storm cloud. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his fingers gripping the brim of his cap. "I don't know, Mr. Williams. This feels wrong." Ethan's tone grew colder, cutting off any further protest. "You don't have a choice. Neither of you do. Mark lowered his gaze, understanding the futility of arguing. Ethan Williams was a man of unwavering determination, and once he set his mind on something, there was no reversing it. Later that evening, Grace returned home, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor of the estate's grand entrance. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent the day in the city, completely unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. Ethan waited for her in the drawing room, his posture exuding authority. "Grace," he called as she passed by, his voice firm. She stopped in her tracks, a sigh escaping her lips. "What now, Dad? I'm not in the mood for one of your lectures." Ethan rose from his chair, his gaze piercing. "There won't be any more lectures, Grace. You've made your choices, and now you'll face the consequences." She turned to face him, folding her arms across her chest. "What are you talking about?" "You're getting married," Ethan said, his voice calm but unyielding. Her eyes widened in shock, the words hitting her like a slap. "Married? To who?" "To Mark," Ethan replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The gardener." Grace's shock turned into fury in an instant. "Are you out of your mind? You can't be serious." "I'm very serious," Ethan said. "The wedding is in 2 days. You will marry Mark, and maybe then you'll learn what it means to live in the real world." The 2 days leading up to the wedding passed in a haze of disbelief and fury for Grace. She tried everything she could think of to stop it, pleading, arguing, even threatening to leave the estate altogether. But none of it made a difference. Her father had made up his mind, and when Ethan Williams decided something, there was no changing it. He had orchestrated every detail of her life, and now this marriage was just another example of his control. On the morning of the wedding, Grace stood in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom, staring at her reflection. The dress she wore was simple, lacking the grandeur she had once envisioned for her wedding day. Her hair was neatly pinned, but there was no joy in her appearance, no spark of excitement. Instead, she looked hollow, resigned to a fate she hadn't chosen. "I can't believe this is happening," she muttered, her voice a whisper. Her reflection offered no comfort, only the stark reality of the moment. Outside, the sun shone brightly, casting a picturesque glow over the sprawling vineyard where the ceremony would take place. The beauty of the day felt mocking to Grace, a cruel contrast to the storm of emotions inside her. To her, it might as well have been raining. A knock on the door broke through her thoughts. She turned to see her father entering the room, his expression as stern as ever. "It's time," Ethan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Grace faced him, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You know this is wrong. You know that, right?" Ethan didn't flinch. "It's for your own good, Grace. One day you'll understand." She clenched her fists, biting back the scream that threatened to escape. There was no use in fighting anymore. She would go through with the wedding, but she made a silent vow to herself. Ethan would regret this. As they walked down the grand staircase and out into the garden, Grace felt the weight of what was about to happen settle over her like a heavy cloak. Rows of chairs had been set up, and a small group of guests, mostly close family and estate staff, sat quietly under the ornate archway adorned with flowers. The idyllic setting felt like a cruel joke. Mark stood by the archway, looking as out of place as Grace felt. He wore a plain suit, his rugged features softened slightly by the formality of the occasion. Though his posture was stiff and his discomfort obvious, there was a calmness in his demeanor that infuriated her. How could he be so composed? How could he simply go along with this? The ceremony began, the officiant's voice a distant hum in Grace's ears. She barely registered the words, her mind spinning with thoughts of escape. But when it was time for Mark to say his vows, his steady voice cut through her haze. He looked directly at her, his expression serious but not unkind. For a fleeting moment, Grace saw something in his eyes that startled her. He wasn't happy about this either. Of course he wasn't. Why would he be? He hadn't asked for this any more than she had. And yet, there he was, fulfilling his role with quiet determination. When her turn came, the words felt foreign on her tongue. "I do," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And just like that it was done. Grace Williams was now Grace Carter, married to a man she hardly knew and didn't love. The guests clapped politely as the ceremony concluded, the sound hollow and insincere. Grace's father stood off to the side, his arms crossed and a satisfied look on his face. She shot him a glare filled with venom, but he seemed unfazed. This was his victory, his way of proving that he was still in control. Mark approached her, offering his arm as they walked back toward the guest house. Grace hesitated, her entire body rigid with resentment, but she eventually took his arm. The gesture felt mechanical, like a scene from a play they were both forced to act in. They walked in silence, the distance between them palpable. Once inside the small guest house that was to be their new home, Ethan wasted no time in issuing his final decree. "You'll live here together as husband and wife," he said, his tone as businesslike as ever. "It's modest, but it will suit you both. It's time for you to learn what life is really like, Grace." Grace stared at him, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Of course it's modest," she shot back. "That's the whole point, isn't it?" Ethan ignored the barb, turning on his heel and leaving without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Grace and Mark alone for the first time. The silence between them was heavy, the weight of their unwanted union pressing down like a suffocating fog. Mark was the first to speak. "I'm sorry, Grace," he said quietly, his voice laced with sincerity. "I know this isn't what you wanted." She turned on him, her eyes flashing with fury. "What I wanted? None of this is what I wanted." Her voice cracked under the weight of her emotions. "But I guess that doesn't matter, does it? We're stuck in this now." Mark nodded, his expression somber. "I suppose we are." For a long moment, they stood there in silence, neither knowing what to say or how to move forward. The only thing they knew for sure was that life as they had known it was over. The first morning in the guest house was like waking up in a stranger's life. Grace opened her eyes to the soft light filtering through plain white curtains, a far cry from the luxurious silk drapes she was used to. The bed beneath her was small and squeaked whenever she moved, a harsh reminder of how far she'd fallen from the life of comfort she once knew. For a moment, she lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that it was all a nightmare. But the sound of clinking dishes from the kitchen shattered that illusion. It was real. She was married to Mark Carter, the gardener, and she was trapped in this small, unremarkable house. She sighed heavily, throwing the covers off and trudging to the bathroom. As she splashed cold water on her face, she caught her reflection in the mirror. Her hair was a mess, her eyes puffy from a restless night of anger and disbelief. She barely recognized herself. This wasn't the Grace Williams who once commanded every room she entered, who lived a life of ease and luxury. This was someone entirely different, someone stripped of control and left to fend for herself in a world she hadn't chosen. When she finally emerged from the bedroom, Mark was already sitting at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. He looked up as she walked in, offering her a tentative smile. "Morning," he said softly, his voice carrying a cautious warmth. Grace ignored him, heading straight for the fridge to grab a bottle of water. She wasn't in the mood for pleasantries, especially not with the man who now, technically, was her husband. It didn't matter how kind or patient he seemed, he was part of the situation her father had forced on her, and she wasn't about to forgive that. "You should eat something," Mark said after a moment, nodding toward the plate of scrambled eggs he'd set on the table. "I made breakfast." Grace glanced at the plate, but her appetite was nowhere to be found. Instead, she took a long sip of water and set the bottle down on the counter with a loud thud. "I'm not hungry," she said flatly. Mark nodded, unfazed by her cold response. He returned his attention to his coffee, the silence between them thick and uncomfortable. Grace could feel his eyes on her, but she refused to meet his gaze. She couldn't stay in the house any longer. It felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on her. Without a word, she grabbed her jacket from the hook by the door and walked outside, letting the door slam shut behind her. The crisp morning air hit her face, bringing a brief sense of relief. But it wasn't enough to quell the frustration boiling inside her. She felt like a prisoner in her own life, and no amount of fresh air could change that. The guest house was perched on the edge of the vineyard, surrounded by rows of neatly arranged grapevines that stretched as far as the eye could see. The early sun bathed the landscape in a golden glow, the mountains in the distance providing a picturesque backdrop. It should have been beautiful, serene even. But to Grace, it was a cage. She began walking aimlessly, her steps quick and purposeful as if putting distance between herself and the house would somehow ease the anger churning inside her. She didn't know where she was going, and she didn't care. All she knew was that she couldn't stay. As she wandered through the vineyard, memories of her old life flooded her mind. Shopping in Beverly Hills, extravagant dinners, luxury vacations on private islands. Everything she had taken for granted was now gone, replaced by this strange, stripped-down existence. Her father had orchestrated it all, ripping away the life she loved to teach her some twisted lesson. And now here she was, married to a man she barely knew, surrounded by rows of grapes and open skies. Grace kicked at the dirt path, sending a few small stones skittering into the vines. "This is so stupid," she muttered under her breath. "I don't belong here." After wandering for what felt like hours, she reluctantly made her way back to the guest house. The kitchen was empty, but it was clear that Mark had cleaned up the breakfast dishes and disappeared, likely to work in the garden. For a brief moment, she felt a twinge of guilt. He had tried to be kind, and she had thrown it back in his face. But she quickly brushed the thought aside. This wasn't about being nice. This was about her life being upended, and no amount of scrambled eggs or polite smiles was going to fix that. She flopped down onto the couch in the small living room, staring blankly at the ceiling as the hours dragged by. There were no shopping trips to plan, no parties to attend, no social calendars to fill. The days of luxury and indulgence were over, and all that stretched ahead of her now was a vast, uncertain void. By the time the sun began to set, the door creaked open, and Mark stepped inside. His face was flushed from a day spent working in the garden, and his clothes bore the dirt and sweat of someone who had spent hours toiling under the sun. He glanced at Grace, his expression unreadable. "I'm going to make dinner," he said after a moment. "You're welcome to join me." Grace didn't respond. She simply stared at him, her arms crossed over her chest, her face a mask of defiance. After a beat, Mark turned and headed into the kitchen, the sound of pots and pans breaking the silence. As Grace sat there, the scent of cooking wafting through the air, she felt a strange mix of emotions she couldn't quite pin down. She hated the situation she was in, hated the life her father had forced on her. But Mark's quiet patience, his refusal to push or demand, left her feeling something she wasn't ready to confront, a twinge of respect. But no, she wasn't going to let herself soften. Not yet. If her father thought she would just fall into line and accept this life, he was sorely mistaken. Grace was determined to make this as difficult as possible. The days that followed were an uneasy dance of avoidance and routine. Grace woke each morning to the sound of birds outside her window, a far cry from the city noise she'd grown accustomed to. For a brief moment, as the sunlight streamed through the curtains, she would forget where she was. But the creaking of the old guest house floorboards or the faint hum of Mark working in the garden would quickly remind her. This wasn't a dream. This was her life now. She tried to ignore him. If he wasn't in her way, she wasn't going to bother with him. Mark, to his credit, gave her space. He was polite but never pushy, going about his work quietly and leaving her alone unless there was something he needed to address. It was infuriating how calm he seemed, how unaffected by their situation. Grace couldn't understand it. Didn't he feel trapped too? Didn't he resent her father for forcing him into this absurd arrangement? One morning, as she sat at the small kitchen table sipping water, she noticed Mark outside through the window. He was bent over a bed of flowers, carefully pruning the delicate petals. His movements were deliberate, almost meditative, and there was a peaceful rhythm to the way he worked. For a moment, Grace found herself watching him, trying to make sense of his calm demeanor. How could someone live like this? To Grace, life was meant to be a whirlwind of excitement. Fast cars, luxurious hotels, exclusive parties. Yet here was Mark, content with the simple act of tending to a garden. It was baffling. And, annoyingly, she couldn't seem to stop thinking about it. Later that day, feeling restless, she found herself wandering through the estate. The sprawling vineyard stretched out around her, the neat rows of grapevines humming with life under the golden sunlight. The air smelled of earth and ripening fruit, a sensory contrast to the perfume-drenched air of Beverly Hills. It should have been peaceful, but Grace couldn't let herself feel it. She was too angry, too frustrated. Her wandering eventually brought her back to the garden, where Mark was still working. He didn't look up when she approached, but it was clear he knew she was there. Grace stood at a distance, her arms crossed as she observed him. His focus was unwavering as he knelt in the dirt, his hands moving deftly to weed and trim the flower beds. The simplicity of it infuriated her, but she couldn't look away. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "Didn't think I'd see you out here," he said, glancing up briefly. Grace shrugged, her tone sharp. "I didn't have anything better to do." Mark nodded, unfazed by her clipped response. "Fair enough. It's not exactly exciting around here." Grace snorted. "Exciting? Try unbearable." He smiled faintly, brushing some dirt off his hands as he stood. "I guess that depends on what you're looking for." "And what is it you're looking for?" she shot back, her arms still tightly crossed. "Peace? Simplicity?" Mark tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "I suppose so. I've never really needed much. Just knowing I'm doing something I care about, that's enough for me." Grace stared at him, incredulous. "That's ridiculous. You've never wanted more? No ambitions? No dreams?" Mark's smile softened, and for the first time, she noticed the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the edges when he did. "Dreams don't have to be big to matter, Grace. Sometimes, they're just about living a life you can be proud of." Grace didn't know how to respond to that. She wanted to dismiss his words, to roll her eyes and tell him how absurd he sounded. But something about his calm confidence gave her pause. "Well, good for you, I guess," she muttered, turning away. "But don't expect me to join your little gardening club." Mark chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "Suit yourself." The conversation lingered in Grace's mind long after she left the garden. She couldn't understand why someone would choose such a small, quiet life when the world was full of possibilities. And yet, there was something unsettling about the way his words stayed with her. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the vineyard in shades of amber and gold, Grace found herself staring out the window of the guest house. The scene before her was beautiful in a way she hadn't expected. The soft rustle of the vines in the evening breeze, the way the light danced on the leaves. She had never cared for this kind of simplicity before, but now, for reasons she didn't fully understand, it captivated her. She shook her head, brushing the thought away. This was temporary. It had to be. As soon as she could, she would leave this place behind and return to the life she belonged to. This quiet, unassuming world wasn't hers. It couldn't be. But as she climbed into bed that night, her mind kept returning to Mark's words, to the way he spoke about his life with such calm assurance. For the first time, she found herself wondering if there was something she was missing, something she hadn't allowed herself to see. The days began to blur together as Grace settled into a reluctant rhythm. The mornings, once filled with the hum of city life, were now accompanied by the soft rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. The quiet was unsettling at first, but slowly, it began to feel less suffocating. Still, she kept her guard up, refusing to let herself adapt fully to this new life. Mark remained a steady presence, working in the garden, maintaining the vineyard, and moving through his day with a quiet determination that both annoyed and intrigued her. He never pressed her to talk or participate, which was almost worse. His patience left her no one to fight with, no outlet for her simmering anger. Instead, she was left alone with her thoughts, which grew louder with each passing day. One afternoon, Grace found herself walking through the estate again, her steps slower this time. She noticed things she hadn't before: the bright, vibrant colors of the flowers, the way the sun warmed her skin, the rhythmic way the grapevines swayed in the breeze. For someone who had spent her life chasing luxury and indulgence, the simplicity of this place began to feel strangely grounding. Her aimless wandering brought her back to the garden, where Mark was working as usual. He was kneeling in the dirt, his hands carefully pruning a rose bush. His focus was so complete that he didn't notice her right away. Grace stood at the edge of the garden, watching him with a mix of curiosity and frustration. She couldn't understand how he could find satisfaction in something so mundane. After a moment, Mark looked up, his gaze meeting hers. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stood, offering her a small smile. "You're becoming a regular out here," he said, his tone light. Grace crossed her arms, shifting uncomfortably. "Don't get used to it." Mark chuckled softly. "I wouldn't dream of it." She hesitated, glancing around the garden before finally speaking. "How do you do it?" she asked, her voice edged with curiosity. "How do you find peace in all this?" Mark tilted his head, considering her question. "I don't think about it too much," he admitted. "I just take it one day at a time. There's something satisfying about putting in the work and seeing it grow. It's grounding." "Grounding," Grace echoed, her tone skeptical. "I don't get it. Don't you ever want more?" Mark smiled, but there was a depth in his expression that caught her off guard. "More isn't always better, Grace. Sometimes it's just noise." Grace frowned, unable to wrap her head around his perspective. "That's easy to say when you've never had more. You don't even know what you're missing." "Maybe," Mark said with a shrug. "But I've also seen what happens when people chase too much. They lose sight of what really matters." His words struck a chord she didn't want to acknowledge. For years, her life had been a constant pursuit of status, approval, and all the trappings of wealth. And yet, here she was, feeling more adrift than she ever had before. She hated that Mark's calm, steady demeanor made her question things she'd always taken for granted. "Well, it sounds boring to me," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. Mark's smile didn't falter. "It's not for everyone." They stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them thick but not entirely uncomfortable. Grace shifted her weight, feeling an odd pull to stay even though she wanted to leave. "You should try it sometime," Mark said after a moment, his voice light but sincere. "It might surprise you." Grace rolled her eyes, but there was no real malice in the gesture. "Not likely." Mark chuckled again, turning back to the rose bush. "Suit yourself?" As he resumed his work, Grace lingered for a moment longer before walking away. She told herself it was because she had nothing better to do, but the truth was harder to admit. There was something about Mark's quiet confidence that drew her in, even as she resisted it. Over the next few days, Grace found herself watching Mark more often, though she told herself it was out of boredom. She noticed the way he moved with purpose, his hands deft and steady as he worked in the garden. There was a rhythm to it, a kind of peace she couldn't understand but couldn't entirely ignore. One morning, as she stood by the window sipping her coffee, she caught herself thinking about what Mark had said. About appreciating the little things. She scoffed at the idea, shaking her head as if to dispel the thought. But it lingered, refusing to be pushed aside. By the end of the week, Grace felt a shift within herself, subtle but undeniable. She wasn't ready to admit it, not to Mark, not to herself, but the walls she had built around her resentment were beginning to crack. She hated it. She hated how this quiet life was starting to feel less foreign and how Mark's steady presence was becoming something she looked for each day. But most of all, she hated the tiny, persistent thought that maybe, just maybe, there was something she could learn from this life after all. As the days passed, Grace found herself slipping into a routine she hadn't expected. Mornings began with the sound of birds and the warm glow of sunlight filtering through the modest curtains. She would sit by the window with her coffee, watching Mark work in the garden, his movements unhurried and purposeful. At first, she told herself it was boredom that kept her watching, but as time went on, she realized it was something more. She was beginning to notice the world around her in a way she never had before. The vineyard, once a symbol of her father's control, began to take on a new meaning. The rows of grapevines stretched endlessly, their green leaves swaying gently in the breeze. The vibrant flowers in the garden, the earthy scent of the soil, and the quiet hum of life all around her, it was all starting to feel peaceful. One afternoon, Grace wandered out to the garden, unable to stay cooped up in the guest house any longer. She didn't have a destination in mind, but her feet carried her toward Mark, who was tending to a row of lavender plants. He looked up as she approached, wiping his hands on a cloth tucked into his back pocket. "Grace," he said, his tone neutral but welcoming. "Didn't expect to see you out here." She shrugged, crossing her arms as she glanced around. "It's not like I have anywhere else to go." Mark nodded, leaning against the edge of the flower bed. "Fair enough." They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. Grace finally broke the quiet, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Why do you do this? Day after day, working out here like it's the most important thing in the world." Mark tilted his head, studying her as if trying to decide how much to say. "Because it matters," he said simply. "Not in the way you're thinking, not for money or recognition. But to me it matters. It's something I can put my heart into and see the results. It's honest work." "Honest work," Grace repeated, a hint of sarcasm in her tone. "That sounds like something my father would say." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "Somehow, I doubt he means it the same way I do." Grace smirked despite herself, brushing her hair back from her face. "Probably not." She hesitated, glancing at the lavender plants he'd been working on. "So, what's so special about this?" she asked, gesturing vaguely. "It's just a bunch of plants?" Mark's expression softened. "It's not just about the plants. It's about the process. The care you put in, the patience it takes. You can't rush it. You just have to let it grow." Grace rolled her eyes but didn't walk away. Instead, she leaned against the garden's wooden fence, watching as Mark returned to his work. His hands moved deftly, almost instinctively, as if he could communicate with the plants themselves. There was a kind of grace to his movements, a calm she couldn't understand but couldn't entirely dismiss. "Must be nice," she said after a while, her voice quieter now. "To feel that way about something." Mark glanced up at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "You've never had that? Something you cared about just for the sake of it?" Grace shook her head, her expression guarded. "Not really. Everything in my life has always been about appearances, about keeping up with expectations. Even the things I wanted were more about making a statement than actually enjoying them." Mark nodded thoughtfully, his gaze steady. "Maybe that's why this feels so foreign to you. It's not about what anyone else thinks. It's just about being." "Just being," Grace echoed, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "That sounds boring." Mark smiled faintly, turning his attention back to the lavender. "It's not boring if you let yourself see it for what it is." Grace didn't respond, but she stayed there, leaning against the fence as Mark worked. The conversation lingered in her mind long after she returned to the guest house. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she found herself thinking about what Mark had said. About patience, about letting things grow. The idea unsettled her, but it also stirred something she couldn't quite name. The next morning, she woke earlier than usual, the sound of birdsong pulling her from a restless sleep. She looked out the window to see Mark already in the garden, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. For a moment, she just watched him, the quiet rhythm of his movements strangely soothing. For the first time, Grace wondered if there was something she could learn from this life, something she had been too stubborn to see. It wasn't a comfortable thought, but it was one she couldn't shake. The next week brought an unexpected shift for Grace. The life she had once dismissed as small and meaningless was beginning to feel like something else entirely. The vineyard's quiet rhythm, the simplicity of the guest house, and even Mark's calm presence were no longer things she resented. They were, somehow, becoming a strange sort of comfort. It wasn't an immediate change, nor was it one Grace fully understood. But she began to linger in the garden longer, asking Mark questions about his work, her tone less sharp, her curiosity genuine. She found herself noticing the delicate details of the flowers he cared for, the way the sunlight filtered through the grapevines in the late afternoon. Little by little, the walls she had built around her anger and resentment began to crumble. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Grace sat on the porch of the guest house, watching the vineyard bathed in golden light. Mark appeared a few minutes later, his hands and shirt streaked with dirt from a day's work. He hesitated for a moment before taking a seat next to her, the silence between them comfortable for the first time. "Looks like you're starting to enjoy the view," Mark said, his voice light but sincere. Grace glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe. It's not as bad as I thought it was. Mark chuckled, leaning back against the porch railing. That's progress. They sat in silence for a while, the cool evening air wrapping around them like a blanket. Grace felt something stir inside her, a realization she wasn't sure she was ready to face. This life, this quiet simplicity, it wasn't what she had wanted, but maybe, just maybe, it was what she needed. Mark, she began hesitantly, her voice soft, about this whole arrangement. He turned to her, his expression steady but curious. What about it? She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. I hated it at first. I hated you, this house, the vineyard. Everything. I thought it was all some kind of punishment. Mark nodded slowly, waiting for her to continue. But now, Grace trailed off, staring out at the vineyard. Now I'm starting to think it's not all bad. That maybe there's more to this life than I realized. Mark's gaze softened, a flicker of hope crossing his face. What changed? Grace shrugged, her smile faint but real. I guess. The way you are, how calm you are about everything. It's annoying, but it's also comforting. Mark laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Annoying and comforting? I'll take that as a compliment. Grace shook her head, her own laugh slipping out despite herself. For the first time, the weight of the past few months felt lighter. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't walking into it alone. The days continued to blend together, each one bringing Grace closer to a life she hadn't expected but was beginning to embrace. Her father remained a distant figure, his attempts to control her life growing weaker with each passing week. She stopped thinking about what he might say or do. For the first time, she was making choices for herself. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Grace turned to Mark, her expression serious. I want to do this for real, she said, her voice steady. Mark frowned slightly, not understanding. What do you mean? She hesitated, then looked him in the eye. This marriage, it wasn't our choice. But I want to make it one. I want us to start over. On our terms? Mark's face lit up with a smile, the kind that reached his eyes. You're sure about this? Grace nodded, her heart full for the first time in years. I've never been more sure. The ceremony was small and simple, just like the life they were building together. Under the vineyard's arching grapevines, Grace and Mark exchanged vows that were no longer forced but freely given. There were no guests, no grand displays of wealth or power, only the two of them and the quiet promise of a future they would create together. As they walked hand in hand back to the guest house, the setting sun casting golden light over the vineyard, Grace felt a deep sense of peace. This wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was the one she had chosen. And for the first time, she felt truly free. Mark squeezed her hand gently, his voice breaking the silence. What are you thinking about? Grace glanced at him, her smile soft but certain. That I'm finally where I'm supposed to be. And as they stepped into their small home, the vineyard stretching out behind them, Grace knew she had found something she never thought she'd have, happiness. Not in the grandeur of her old life, but in the quiet beauty of a new one. A life she had built with someone who had shown her the value of the little things. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Your interest and support inspire us to bring you more captivating tales filled with emotions, twists, and the complexity of life, love, betrayal, and redemption. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. We value your voice and want to hear what you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story, and hit the notification bell to stay updated. Thank you for bringing this channel to life with your views and encouragement. See you in the next story.